This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Julia is a researcher for Amnesty International, and let me just make sure I've got the right one. She's also a human rights lawyer, and she's Amnesty's expert on counterterrorism and human rights in Europe, and works, do you work in London? Yeah, in the International Secretariat in London. She's actually the only one of our guests who's been brave enough to bring her kids, taking advantage of the trip to enjoy North Carolina's beauty. So we're happy to have her for both reasons. She's conducted extensive research and advocacy in a number of areas, including the prohibition against torture, unlawful or extraordinary rendition, non-refoulement obligations, the use of diplomatic assurances. Who was it that called her the queen of diplomatic assurances? Yeah, Meg. So she's got a really comprehensive knowledge of a lot of the tactics used during the War on Terror. She was previously a colleague of mine at Human Rights Watch, though we never met. I remember hearing her name, where she worked from 1996 to 2009. She's authored numerous reports, articles, and amicus briefs on a range of counterterrorism topics. She's done advocacy at the UN, the Council of Europe, the European Union, and national levels, and also served as an expert in individual cases before UN treaty bodies, European Court, the UK Special Immigration Appeals Commission, the Commission on Inquiry into the Actions of Canadian Officials in Maher Arar's case, and in US federal court. In July 2008, she monitored the military commission of Salim Hamdan, obviously one of the big cases, Osama bin Laden's former driver at Guantanamo Bay. She's also a member of the International Bar Association's Terrorism Task Force. I can't remember who's next. Is it Lisa is next or Cynthia? I think Cynthia's next. And then our next guest is Cynthia Brown. We're so pleased to have her. Cynthia, I first met her, actually, she doesn't remember this, but when she was running for Senate. And damn it, I gave you money. Damn it, not because I gave her money, but because I wish she was our senator. And I met her again a second time when she served as a commissioner on the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and became even more impressed with not only her intelligence and grace, but her calm under pressure. Cynthia is the principal consultant of the Sojourner Group, a business she founded to help nonprofit groups strengthen their leadership and address their organizational development issues. She's a grassroots organizer and leader, a former Durham City Councilwoman. She, I'm skipping over the stuff I already said here. She is a native of Reidsville, North Carolina, as an undergraduate degree in political science from Bennett College, a Master of Public Affairs from UNC Greensboro. She was a W.K. Kellogg National Fellow and has studied cultural, racial, and economic justice issues in Australia, Brazil, Guatemala, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Egypt, New Zealand, and Chile. She makes a mean pot of chili, too. I have personal experience with that. Her many organizational affiliations include the North Carolina Coalition on Black and Brown Civic Participation. She's a founding member, the Latino Community Development Center, North Carolina Conservation Network, Democracy NC, Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and I didn't get a chance to put in that you had written me the email about is it the conservation?
The conservation fund.
The conservation fund is another thing that Cynthia's been working on recently. And then Lisa Magarrell is here. I also met Lisa in the context of the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She's now works with the International Center for Transitional Justice, which some people will recognize. It's a NGO that in part came out of the South African TRC experience. She is currently the director of U.S. programs at the ICTJ, has traveled the world talking about truth commissions, reparations. She is a lawyer with extensive experience in human rights. She's provided technical assistance on transitional justice issues in Peru, the United States, and a number of other countries, including Turkey, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't you make a trip to Turkey in 2006? I was actually there at the same time. And has written widely on the subject, including a recent book based on her experience in Greensboro. So please join me in welcoming our guests. We'll start with Julia.
Well, I want to thank Robin Kirk, of course, for inviting Amnesty to be here today. In addition to Duke and UNC, I was very happy, of course, to see the local Amnesty group, Group 213 from Raleigh, as a co-sponsor. Warms my heart. At this time of the day, it's very difficult, isn't it? I can see you all struggling to try to pay attention to me. So let me tell you how easy I'm going to make this for you. We are going to do a series of lists, and here is how it will go. I will tell you one personal story, two professional stories. I will talk about 3 reports briefly. I will tell you about 4 principles of accountability. I will then go from 5 through 10 countries where accountability processes are actually in process as we speak, and I will end with 1 message. So, the personal story is actually very, very personal. I did bring my children with me. I travel a great deal. It's very difficult to leave them, so I decided to bring them, and I brought them to the interfaith service yesterday. And my 10-year-old son was so attentive to what was happening at the service, and I was very mindful of how attentive he was. And we were speaking about it in the car afterward, and during the service, one of the speakers said, when you hurt or abuse your brother or your sister, the cries that you hear are your own. And we were talking about this in the car, and he said, Mom, he said, that had such an effect on me. So if you doubt that you've had an impact, I can tell you you've already had an impact before you even walk out of this room. And I thank the goddesses for that particular impact. In terms of 2 personal stories, I think it's very important for us to get outside of the U.S. for a minute and to look at the rest of the world. And my presentation is really going to start now to go beyond the borders of the U.S. Most of the work that I do is in Brussels, Geneva, Strasbourg. I don't work a lot on the United States. What my work entails is seeking accountability in Europe for European complicity in renditions and secret detention. That's one aspect of my work. And when you talk about President Obama's statement that he only wants to look forward and not back, you need to understand that that message is being heard loud and clear in other places. I was with a very high-level EU official during this summer, and we were having coffee in his office, and I said, now we really need to get down to brass tacks about what the Commission and other EU institutions have been doing about accountability. And he looked at me and he said, no, he said, I'm with your president. I'm interested in looking forward, not in looking back. And I said, oh, that's right. So all those people who were tortured and transferred without due process and were victims of enforced disappearance, we're just going to forget about them. And I think it was a very unusual thing for me to do, to be so kind of it was really very aggressive. I was very disappointed. And he redoubled. He took a step back and he said, well, no, wait a minute. We've written to the Lithuanians. We've written to the Poles. We've written, and he kind of tried to scramble to catch up. But I really encourage all of you, when people say those things, to challenge them politely, but definitely challenge them. You know, President Obama himself was in Indonesia recently where he told the Indonesian government that they had to look back into their past and be accountable for human rights violations in their past. Take that language, repackage it, and use it in your advocacy. The second story is of my exchange with a Danish official in Washington just a couple of weeks ago. And I approached him. It's someone that I know who's been very generous to me in terms of information. And as I approached him, he said, oh, Julia, you're not going to nag me about those transfers to torture again, are you? That diminishing of the importance of this issue, that framing it as something that nags at you, but you don't really want to deal with. We really need to not accept that diminishing of this issue. We need to not accept someone saying that we're being a nag. All right, we are not being nags. We're being advocates for accountability for gross, egregious human rights violations. And so when we talk about Obama's worldview, we need to remember that it's a worldview that has proliferated and is infecting others on the international stage. Having said that, I come to you today with examples where accountability processes are ongoing. And there is an engine, I think, in Europe at the moment. And it's an engine that we need to help move along and chug and help to see it chug along. It is based on 3 reports that I like to think of as the Bible for accountability to date. There are many NGO reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, various centers like Meg Center have put out great reports. But the Bibles in terms of the research, of course, are Dick Marty's reports in 2006, 2007 from the Council of Europe, the ones that Gavin Simpson researched. The TDIP report, the Special Committee report from the European Parliament, which largely piggybacks off the work of the Council of Europe. And a more recent report that was just released in January of 2010, and I encourage people to try to get their hands on this one. This is also one that Gavin worked on secret detentions worldwide. If you have those 3 reports, you can pretty much help to dispel the notion that there is no evidence out there that these actions occurred, that they occurred on a global level, and that they were in violation of international law. Okay. Moving on to my 4th point about accountability. We've got the reports. We know these activities occurred. You've heard a wealth of information today about that. What does accountability actually mean? And my colleague, Juan Mendez, who Lisa used to work with at the International Center for Transitional Justice, a torture survivor from Argentina, packaged this very nicely recently when we were together in Washington, and I'm shamelessly stealing it from him. So I make no claims to originality. 4 principles for accountability, okay? Number 1, truth. Number 2, justice. Number 3, reparation. Number 4, reform. Very quickly, truth. Absolutely, the public deserves to know the truth about what happened in the last 8 to 10 years with respect to renditions and secret detentions. There's no doubt about that. The victims absolutely deserve to know the truth about what happened to them. One of the things that I think has been missing today is many of the victims who were picked up and subject to these horrible abuses have no idea what evidence there actually exists against them. Whether they are Guantanamo Bay detainees whose dossiers are in secret, whether they are renditions from Europe, whose the information against them is secret. There is so much secrecy shrouding this phenomenon that just beginning to peel back the layers is a task in and of itself. Justice. Truth is a great thing, but justice is the next step. I've heard a lot today from people saying the courts may not be the best venue, but we have to work both sides. We always have to work both sides. Stephen Watts said, we began this process, we knew that it was almost certainly not going to go anywhere. In Europe, certain things are going somewhere. So it makes sense to always work in parallel. There can be truth and there can be reconciliation, but that does not preclude the possibility, nor should it preclude the possibility of going into court and seeking accountability for criminal violations and looking at complicity at the state level for a state's violation of its international treaty obligations. Reparation. Victims of human rights violations deserve reparation. What does that mean? Does it just mean compensation? Because we often hear that people will go into court seeking reparation and all they're looking for is a big check. No, reparation is a much more fulsome concept. The idea is to make someone fit again. The basis of the word repara is to put someone make someone whole. I'm not sure that a victim of torture can be made whole again, but the notion that we can put them back in a position where they're fit to go forward in their lives is a possibility. And that means not just money. It means an apology. You have no idea what an apology can mean to a victim of a human rights violation. I'll talk a little bit about that more when I talk about some of the processes that happened in Canada. Satisfaction, the idea that this is not, well, satisfaction is the apology, actually, excuse me. Non-repetition, some notion that this isn't going to happen again, either to them or to others. And in terms of their own personal fitness, it goes beyond money into mental and psychological rehabilitation, and not just for them. Under international law, the rehabilitation principle extends to their family members. And notions of family in various cultures mean different things. So maybe for me, it would mean my son and my daughter and my husband. But for families where extended family is the norm, international law, we need to push international law to understand cultural variations in terms of what family formation means. So I challenge you when you're out there advocating for victims' rights to really give it the full throttle. Talk about the whole picture in terms of making a victim of torture fit. Okay. The fourth principle is reform, and this is potentially the hardest right now with respect to this issue. What really needs fundamental reform, and what many of us who are doing this work out in the field see, is civilian oversight of intelligence and security agencies is a critical, and I would almost say the first type of reform that we need. Anybody who knows anything about this realm understands that that is a very tough nut to crack. And this is a long haul to get to that fourth principle of reform. I will say that the International Commission of Jurists has a plan, along with a couple of the special rapporteurs, to look at this issue. Right? But as you are going about your work here in North Carolina, it's a great thing to go after those who you think are directly implicated, but it's also another thing to think about ways, creative thinking, to understand how we as citizens should have some type of oversight over our intelligence and security services that has meaning. Okay? So those are the four principles of accountability. After years of this happening, after years of renditions and secret detention, where are we outside of the United States? And a gentleman asked me, he said, I really want to know where they are now. And I feel like I'm doing a TMZ, you know, where are they now? And I'm just going to selectively talk about where some of these processes are now, and that where some of these victims are now. I'd like to start with Canada, because we heard from Stephen Watt and from a couple of others about Maher Arar, who is a Syrian Canadian rendered from the United States to Syria, where he was tortured, and came back to Canada. Now, Maher has very few options in the U.S., as Stephen has said. He's hanging by a thread in the U.S. courts. But in Canada, there was a full public inquiry into the role of Canadian actors in Maher's transfer from the United States to Syria and his torture in Syria. A few of us in this room participated in the inquiry, and while the inquiry had its ups and its downs, at the end of the day, it is possibly the most fulsome accountability process that we have seen to date. The inquiry determined at the end of the day in a 2-volume report that Maher Arar was exonerated from any connection with terrorism in any manner. There was a 14-page expert report that confirmed the fact that he was in fact tortured in Syrian custody. He was granted a $10 million compensation and was also given other various forms of support by the Canadian government, albeit not as much as we would have liked to have seen. But on the global stage, this process was fairly fulsome. Maher himself, obviously, the family had many ups and downs. But he has recently begun a new online magazine called Prism Security Monitor, Security Monitor magazine, where he is looking at security, national, and terrorist issues and editing the magazine online. So this is an example. I don't want to say it's perfect, but it is an example of moving on, using something that was so horrific. There was some transformational power that Maher and his family invoked, and they were able to move on. The next case I'd like to talk about has a direct connection to North Carolina. It is a case in Sweden of Ahmed Giza and Mohammed Al-Zari, two Egyptians who were abducted one was at a bus stop, one was, I think, at school. On December 18th, 2001, they were abducted by Swedish law enforcement officials. They were brought to Bromma Airport, went through the entire security check that Meg talked about, clothes stripping, sedatives were inserted into their rectums, etc. They were handed over to the CIA. They were loaded onto a plane. They were taken to Egypt, where they were in fact tortured and ill-treated. The Swedish NGO community did incredible work, and the Swedish media community did incredible work on those cases. That was the first rendition case that anybody really, really had heard of, as early as it was late 2001 when Amnesty International issued an urgent action on that case, and then others picked it up fairly quickly. What has happened to these men since then? They have had no accountability in the United States, I'm afraid to say. But in Sweden, there were two investigations. One was by a parliamentary ombudsman, and another was by the Constitutional Committee of the Swedish Parliament. As a result of the international attention to these cases, both of these men had their expulsion orders by the Swedish government revoked. The Swedish government essentially said, we issued these expulsion orders and transferred these men unlawfully, and we are post-fact going to revoke those expulsion orders. Of course, the men were already in Egypt. Nonetheless, symbolically, there was great significance to that. Both men were awarded compensation amounts of compensation, about 3 million kroner. And I must say that these awards were made pursuant to decisions by UN treaty bodies. The Committee Against Torture decided against Sweden in Ahmed Giza's case, and the Human Rights Committee decided against Sweden in the case of Al-Zari. So we have actually jurisprudence at the international level that says that Sweden violated the ban against sending people to places where they are at risk of torture. And then Sweden took those cases and then did make some compensation. We still do not have a full, effective, impartial investigation that holds individuals criminally liable, which we should have, but we do have some accountability in those cases. I will say, though, that the Swedish government recently refused to give the men residence permits in case they ever want to come back, but there is it's not enough, but something actually is happening. Ahmed Giza remains in prison. Mohammed Al-Zari was actually released in 2003 without charge or trial. Okay. In terms of the secret sites, I'd like to move on to those. There were 3 countries that have been named as hosting secret prisons in Europe. All right. Romania, Poland, and Lithuania. In the Romanian case, the Romanians did hold a parliamentary inquiry. And that's virtually all I can say to you. Because it was shrouded entirely in secrecy. There were no terms of reference that were ever released to the public. There was no mandate set. Both the European Commission and Amnesty International wrote to the Romanians on those markers, wanting to know precisely what the terms were. We were told that that was completely secret. Then the report came out, I believe it was in 2008. The Romanian Senate adopted the full report in 2008. No one's ever seen the report, to our knowledge. We don't know what the report says. We do know from the Romanians that they have completely exonerated themselves of any participation in any secret site at any time. I will say that there is a renewed effort at EU level to at least be in communication with the Romanian government to see if that process cannot be jump-started. Especially in light of the UN report having been issued just this year. In Poland, there is an ongoing criminal investigation into allegations of a secret prison in northern northern Poland, in Szymanów, as Gavin had said. Now I believe that this criminal investigation has more promise than others possibly believe it has. It is true that there is a great deal of secrecy around the proceedings, but nonetheless, we do see steps that are being taken by the Polish prosecutor that are incremental and forward-looking. And we have some sense that at some point we may have a process that has integrity, or at least some integrity, in Poland. And there are named victims from the sites in Poland as well, which gives added legitimacy to the claim that people were held there by being able to name a victim, and then you actually have much more leverage if you can name a victim. So at any rate, there is a process in Poland. Most recently, you may have heard that Lithuania was named by ABC News as having hosted a secret prison outside of Vilnius. Now, what's very interesting about Lithuania is the Lithuanian president was politically engaged in this debate and was on the side of the angels, at least in her rhetoric. She wanted to see an investigation go forward. There was an initial investigation that was a whitewash. And then Thomas Hammarberg from the Council of Europe went to visit Lithuania and caught the ear of the president yet again. And a second investigation, parliamentary inquiry, commenced. And it is a fascinating thing to note that investigation resulted in a finding that, yes, indeed, 2 sites had been prepared to hold detainees who actually were victims. So I didn't actually misspeak. And those sites were prepared at the behest of the CIA by Lithuania, with the collusion of Lithuanian security actors. What's incredible about this is it is, in fact, the first time that an inquiry of this sort has admitted that the CIA requested that sites be prepared and that sites were in fact prepared. What we don't have yet is an admission that people were actually held there. The parliamentary inquiry had an extremely narrow mandate, 3 questions. Did sites exist? Did the politicians at the very highest levels know about them? And was the sovereignty of the Lithuanian state breached? Okay, so a very narrow mandate. What happened after the report came out, acknowledging that sites had been prepared for this purpose, there was an advocacy push by Amnesty and others asking for the opening of a criminal investigation. I'm very happy to say a criminal investigation was opened in February of this year. We understood that mandate likewise to be very narrow, but received a letter just last week from the prosecutor stating that a criminal investigation had been opened and they were open to more expansive terms of reference, meaning to go into the issue of if detainees were held there, what were their treatment, who was involved, et cetera. So again, we see some promise, and certainly much more on this front than we see, in the United States. Turning a little bit backwards then, we have Romania, Poland, and Lithuania. We also have an ongoing, the prosecution in Italy. We all know that 23 CIA agents, well, it's 22 CIA agents and 1 military official were found guilty, not of torture though. I think we need to be very clear what we're talking about in terms of these accountability processes. They were found guilty of abducting a person, right, and taking that person off the street and basically engaging in a kidnapping. And that was all they were found guilty of. We do not have a conviction for rendition to torture. Right? And I think sometimes the Italian case is confused as a conviction for rendition to torture. The very high-level officials, however, of the U.S. and the Italian head of their intelligence security service, they were immunized. Either the cases were dismissed based on state secrets, or in the U.S. officials' cases, they had immunity Right. So Armando Spataro, a very courageous, I must say, prosecutor in Italy who would not let this go, is in the process of making a decision whether to appeal to be able to get at those higher level officials. In other cases, such as the UK, we had Bishop Al-Rawi. We were very privileged to have him with us today. The UK government has been completely reticent, very similar to the United States government, in terms of saying we will not have a fulsome inquiry. There are little bits and pieces, a little inquiry, a little investigation here, a little investigation there, but the UK government is deeply implicated in these practices. Whether it is the interrogation of foreign suspects overseas, renditions, or secret detention. I'm sure you all know that there are allegations that UK territory and Diego Garcia may have been used to house prisoners. And so we don't have as quite a positive sense on the UK side, but I will tell you that the pressure is really mounting. And just in closing, I would like to just say that what I see in my work in Europe is a very dynamic landscape right now in terms of accountability and lots of possibilities. They won't remain possibilities, however, if we don't continue doing the activism on that side as well. So while you are doing your job here, in North Carolina and in the United States, holding U.S. officials to account, there is a whole parallel movement in Europe of civil society actors, UN special rapporteurs, very friendly MEPs, European parliamentarians, who are on a daily basis pushing for accountability. The absent in what we are lacking in Europe, of course, is the cooperation of the U.S. government. So I see a really wonderful synergy between what is happening on this side, trying to push the U.S., and what is happening on the European side. And so it is not all doom and gloom. And I really like giving this particular presentation because I almost see it as a little bit of a pep talk to say that all is not lost. The U.S. courts are not the only game in town. And it will take a very, very long time. But I do believe as those layers get peeled back and people just keep at it, never forget Central America or Argentina or Chile, we can all go forward in our work with some sense that accountability it's not right now, but it could happen in the future. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon.
First of all, I want to thank Robin and the Planning Committee for this forum for inviting me to speak. I want to just say a little bit to you about the way this presentation is going to go. Because of limited time, I thought it would be much more efficient to use a video that summarizes the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation process and the reason why this process was even necessary. And so I will, and they said we don't have to move. You'll be fine. I'm going to step over, and this is a 16-minute video, so we'll just look at half of it. It's about 5 minutes and 43 seconds. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges we faced as a part of that Truth and Reconciliation process, and end with some brief comments about the aspects of the experience that I think are important for folks who are thinking about some kind of accountability and truth-seeking process as it relates to rendition.
May God provide this commission with the will, the insight, the vision, the sensitivity and caring to be that catalyst for truth, healing, and restorative justice in this community. What a blessed day.
On June 12, 2004, over 500 people gathered in Greensboro, North Carolina to witness the swearing in of the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States.
It is with great confidence in the people of Greensboro and in this citizen-led process that I charge you as Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners to carry out your work with honor, for much of the quality of the work you do will shape the quality of life in our city and beyond. for years to come. God bless you.
I really did not fully appreciate the magnitude of the endeavor until I was standing in a room with all the people who came for the swearing in, and as I heard different representatives from the community in Greensboro talk about their hopes and their desires for us and for the truth and for reconciliation.
The installation of this commission was the culmination of nearly 5 years of work and planning by a group called the Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project. Initiated by survivors of a violent episode in Greensboro's past, guided by a national advisory board and the International Center for Transitional Justice, and propelled by the participation of a cross-section of Greensboro citizens called the Local Task Force. The project had crafted a selection process and a mandate for a commission independent of any external influence to examine the context, causes, sequence, and consequence of the events of November 3rd, 1979, and to issue a report to the Greensboro community.
When I first heard about the commission, I was excited about its potential for helping our community identify and heal some of the divisions that exist. And I realize a lot of folks in different parts of our community are not aware of those divisions or choose to believe they don't exist. But in my work dealing with racism and diversity and cultural conflict, I see every day evidence of those divisions.
I want to warn
On
people
November
that this
3rd,
is very graphic.
1979, on a bright Saturday morning, a group of labor organizers assembled in Morningside Homes, a predominantly black housing project in Greensboro, for an educational conference and an anti-Klan march with the prominent slogan, "Death to the Klan." A caravan of 9 cars carrying Klan and American Nazi Party members drove to Greensboro to disrupt the march. As the caravan reached the housing project, words were exchanged and a confrontation ensued. The Klan and Nazis took guns from their cars and opened fire on the crowd. Five people were killed. 10 others were wounded. Police did not arrive on the scene until several minutes after the shooting stopped, but news crews and photographers captured the event on film and videotape, and the images from Greensboro were soon broadcast around the world. In the state and federal trials that followed, 2 all-white juries found the Klan and Nazi members not guilty of any crimes. In 1985, a civil suit filed by the relatives of those killed on November 3rd was resolved with the finding that the Greensboro Police Department and members of the Klan and Nazi organizations were jointly liable for the wrongful death of one of the march participants. With a painful collective memory of tragic violence, Greensboro would sometimes prefer to leave the events of November 3rd, 1979, out of the telling of the city's proud history. The Greensboro Project is drawing inspiration and guidance from a number of truth and reconciliation processes around the world, the best known of which is South Africa.
You are going to be a crippled community, whether you like it or not. You are going to be a crippled community as long as you refuse to face up to your past.
So I encourage you to follow up with the Beloved Community Center, which is the repository for a lot of the video and information. And is there still a website up? Yes. The website is still up where you can get a significant amount of information. I'm going to go quickly through the points that I have to make and would encourage more conversation about this later. I'm going to say that I'm going to talk a lot about the challenges of doing this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm going to focus on that, but that does not mean to discourage folks from trying to do it. It's to deal with the reality. And I feel kind of ambivalent about talking about the challenges, because the truth of the matter is that for many of us who were on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if we knew what I'm about to tell you, I would like to think that I would have, but to be honest with you, it's daunting information. I want to divide the challenges into about three categories, one being societal/institutional, one being organizational, and then personal. And so from a societal and institutional perspective, I'd say that societal and institutional resistance, there will be societal and institutional resistance to efforts that challenge authority and that challenge the dominant narrative that people buy into about, in this case, terrorists, in the case of the Greensboro, that somehow the people who were victims of the violence of the Klan Nazis were as violent and therefore not victims because of their ideology as communist workers' parties and people's difference with that. And so there is often a public need to maintain some sense of stability and normalcy, and anything that would upset that is something that you can expect to experience resistance to. In Greensboro, there was an effort to try to get support from the city council to endorse just the inquiry itself, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there was a 6-3 vote with the 3 African Americans voting to support the inquiry and the 6 whites on the city council voting against it. Council members promoted actual rumors about the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission intimidating opponents, and given that I was one of the commissioners and I know that we never tried to do that, it was very disconcerting to hear those kinds of rumors being promoted by public government officials. They were sowing confusion about the sources of funding for our process, and they promoted, because survivors of November 3rd, 79 were part of the Truth and Community Reconciliation process that gave birth to the commission, there was always some effort of suggesting that the Community Reconciliation group was somehow influencing and controlling what we were doing. And again, as a part of the commission that was very sensitive to being objective as we were designed to be, that was misinformation that undermined our ability to be at least viewed with some objectivity by some of the members of the public. There were constant media stories attempting to discredit our efforts. Police officials actually met with church members, leadership of one of the local churches, where we were going to do a public engagement process so that they could discourage the church from allowing us to be meet in that site with the public. Our efforts were undermined by fear and ongoing economic hardship of some of the people who were former residents of the public housing community where the killings took place. People stigmatized by what happened, some of who continue to have economic hardship were by choice and oftentimes being discouraged to assist in our work. Prospective statement givers across the economic spectrum were being discouraged from being a part of our process to try to undermine our success. It was repeatedly suggested that the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation process would undermine economic development in Greensboro, despite economists giving information that suggested quite the contrary. So I would say that just with some of those examples, that what our experience says is that your efforts will be met with indifference at a minimum and resistance at maximum by some in highly polarized body politic where there's intense fear and anger toward anybody who is other, whether they be immigrant, low income, poor, or a person of color. It will be difficult for people who do not see themselves directly affected by rendition to engage efforts to hold our state accountable for participation in government-supported torture. And that's just a reality, because people who lived in Greensboro who were directly affected and who to this day, 25 years later, as we were doing our work, were really resistant to engage in this process because they didn't see that it was relevant because it happened so long ago. To the extent that our efforts, your efforts, will pose a real or imagined threat to economic interests of powerful people in this state, your work will be challenged and undermined using the weight of major institutions like the military, the police, and the media, just to name a few. That's a reality. I think that I think everybody in here, having been a part of this process, understands that, but I think that you need to know that that is a reality as you try to get volunteers who are going to engage in a process to really carry this forward. And then there's the organizational. And when I say organizational, I'm really talking about the organizational process of developing an infrastructure to actually carry forward this process of truth-seeking and accountability. So there are, I would say, about 5 things that I will just touch on briefly. Capacity is a real question. And so I don't think it occurred to us when we accepted this responsibility that we not only would have a volunteer group of commissioners who would take on this work, but that we actually had to find an office and that we had to hire paid staff who would provide the facilitation and support of the work of the commission. And so it was a little bit disconcerting to realize how much time it actually took to do that, especially as we were confronted with having to do fundraising and confront the kind of opposition that was being directed toward us in this process of trying to organize just getting the infrastructure in place so that then we could take on the mandate that we had been given. And then, as far as I know, and actually Lisa is more qualified to answer this, but my understanding is that the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation process was the first of its kind that had resulted from a grassroots effort and not from being government sanctioned. And while on one hand that meant that we were independent and we were free of governmental constraints, the other part of that meant that we didn't get the financial support of the government, and therefore our fundraising was something where we had to get it from independent sources, a lot of donors and other folks who were willing to support this effort. The other issue was trying to find a fiscal agent, a nonprofit to serve as a fiscal agent so we wouldn't have to go through the process of creating a nonprofit, given the limited time we had, which leads to the next issue of time requirement. And it's a twofold issue of the time requirement. The commission in Greensboro was authorized for up to a 2-year period, initially 18 months, so that we could have to ask for an extension of an additional 6 months, which we actually did. But the truth of the matter is that even though we asked for that extra time, we really could have used even more time. Toward the end, what had been 1 or 2 meetings a month for the commission ended up really being weekly meetings, and then as we got closer to the end of our term and our tenure, we had sometimes multiple meetings a week so that we could do the reading of the drafts and editing of our final report. We had a lack of subpoena power, which was an issue because we could not compel anybody to participate in our data gathering and public hearings, and so that was a serious concern for us. And then commissioner commitment. I can tell you unequivocally that there was nobody on this commission who didn't consider at some point saying, I'm out of here. I am not going to hang in here. And so I think that you were confronted with threats to your safety. We literally had somebody, when we were doing outreach through websites of white supremacists, encouraging people to come forward and be a part of our data gathering process, had some man who talked about, first of all, he generated all this information about each one of us. None of what I read about myself even remotely looked like something that was the truth. But then he said at the end, I'd like to reconcile them to the butt of my 12 gauge. And it was gut-wrenching to think that something that you thought was such a noble effort was literally, and everybody, all my friends kept saying, how could you not know that was going to be something that was going to happen? I mean, we live in a crazy world where racism and white supremacy is a reality, and you are dealing with a case where that was rampant. And so it was something But it was also the issue of having a very diverse group. It's a paradox that the diversity of who composed that commission was the strength of the commission in terms of the variety of perspectives, and at the same time, it was those differences that created such tension and struggle around divergent views of our findings. And then there's the personal. You have, I said, self-transformation begins the journey toward the change we seek. To quote my reflections in the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation report, I said, my participation in this process has been nothing less than a life-changing challenge. I have had to confront fears and weaknesses, even as I had had the opportunity to offer my gifts and strengths to the process. Throughout this process, it became increasingly clear that our work is historically important. George Orwell said, during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. However, because we live in a culture dominated by those who are silent about all kinds of injustice, we allow dishonesty to prevail over truth. It is important that people who engage in the process of a truth recovery and accountability process accept the reality that you cannot examine the issue of North Carolina's role in rendition without having to address issues that create the context for why this is even occurring. And that's racism, white supremacy, imperialism, ethnocentrism, hatred of immigrants, classism, and the impact all of that has on you personally. You can't even effectively avoid having to deal with your own inadequacies, your internalized oppression or internalized white supremacy, and the ways we as individuals and a society participate in our and others' oppression. This is meaningful work that has to happen. I know I laid out all of these challenges as if to suggest it's not something to be done. The reality is it's work that absolutely has to be done. But I think that there's all too often times that we take on difficult work and we assume that we can deal with it in a very superficial way. And it is a challenge because when you start to deal in an honest, thorough, deep way in these kinds of issues, it is essential that you are dealing with your own transformation and the challenges you have to pose to yourself about what is raised as you start to uncover the truth about other folks' stuff. I want to just close by saying that I know you may have assumed that I would talk much more deeply about the Greensboro situation. That's why it was so important we have the video to at least encapsulate some major issues as it related to it. But there are two things that I just want to say that I know are absolutely crucial to the ability to be successful with trying to do a process like this. One is that we came into being as a commission because there was a community grassroots driven process. Throughout the commission's tenure, there was ongoing activity by this entity, and when we were done in 2 years, their work continues today. And so it is essential that there is a strong group of folks that have the courage, that has the persistent willingness to continue regardless to what comes up, and the commitment to stay the course. If people don't do that, then you have the report and it goes on the shelf and collects dust and nothing really can happen. When you start to talk about reform, that is, as you raised the issue around accountability, that is what is going to take the time and the organization to stay engaged beyond the life of whatever commission is put in place. The other thing, and it's interesting because it was going to be a great segue to Lisa, but I must say that you saw Lisa was engaged through the International Center for Transitional Justice. You saw that she was there during the community truth reconciliation process prior to the commission. She was an invaluable resource to us with her institution throughout the commission process. And then I'm sure that the relationship may not be as intense, but continues to serve as a resource to the Greensboro process after that. I think that having folks who understand this process, who understand it from a global perspective, and can raise what I think makes the point for me, the kinds of questions that you need to ask yourself. And it's a facilitated role. I don't ever remember being dictated to what to do, but it felt very supportive and helpful. So with that, I would say thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this process. It's been very educational for me as well since I've been here a brief time. Thank you.
I'm prepared for that. Well, I'm not going to speak about Greensboro, so I'll leave that to Cynthia. But I do want to thank the organizers, especially Robin and Deborah, and also Christina for picking us up at the airport and all the other great work you're doing. But all of the sponsors, and I think it's so moving to see how many people have come together to do this work in North Carolina. So it's really an honor to be here. You know, actually, Julia and Juan stole my first point, so I'm going to go back to these points about accountability and maybe take them a little step further about how that might look, what are some of the issues around it, where we are. Because in addition to some of the things that Robin mentioned, one of the projects that I'm working on at the International Center for Transitional Justice is a project on U.S. accountability, particularly with a focus on torture and other abuses of detainees, but also thinking generally about the failures of accountability that existed during the Bush years and of course continue today. So I want to speak to that mostly, and of course afterwards if there's questions and Greensboro comes up and there's something I can add, I'm happy to do that. And I will try to relate it also to people's role in accountability, not just about government, and most of accountability happens because of people outside of government pressing for it. I think it's important also to start on this very positive note about the amount of information that has come out. And this, of course, the information and all of the digging that's been done is a key ingredient for accountability. You know, we have to counter all these efforts to hide information, to cover, to call state secrets, to call, you know, national security reasons not to disclose, when what really is being covered are embarrassing violations of law that, of course, should have much more impact than just an embarrassment to government, but should actually result in accountability. So information is a tool that not only leads us towards other measures of accountability, but it can tip the balance on political will and on actually making things happen. So I did want to start with, you know, accountability, how we think about that, and I will try to bring in a little bit, as I said, the sort of grassroots element of it. And I think you have that exactly right in terms of these ingredients of accountability, and I won't go through in the same terms that Julia mentioned, but I think that when we talk about investigation or an inquiry, we need to think also that there are pieces of this happening all the time, and that one of our objectives needs to be, how do we put all those pieces together? So I think one of the weaknesses that we confront now is that there's this Europe piece, there's the you know, the work that's been done in Congress, there's these Inspector General reports, there's the Office of Professional Responsibility of the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel. So there's all these pieces, but how do we put that together? And that's something that it would be great if there was an independent inquiry at the governmental level doing that and taking to heart the conclusions that one could reach from that effort. But if it's not happening, how can we help that picture to come and take shape? So of course we have journalists, we have Freedom of Information Act, we have a lot of tools at our disposal that I think are incredibly powerful, and we have the kind of work that's been done here in North Carolina. I was very impressed to hear about all of this linking up that's happened between people working in Europe to what's been documented here in North Carolina. I think that's a really positive sign. There has been a call for a commission of inquiry. In most people's terms, it's been most organizations calling for this. It's been a call for a nonpartisan, independent commission of inquiry. It could sit outside of government could sit in the executive or the Congress, and actually at this point probably any of those varieties would be very welcome, even though each one has shortcomings. And I know Stephen mentioned, I think it was Stephen, the need for Congress to take it out of the executive, but we've also seen Congress really fail to oversee and who is going to examine their role. So these are questions that come up in any exercise of accountability. But the response was pretty negative, even though there were high hopes when the Obama administration came in. There were conversations directly with the White House on this, and there was quite a bit of debate inside the White House about it, and I think that's a positive, but that the view of the importance of a commission did not prevail, and that sort of a decision was taken, and that has been a very firm position since, and so we're dealing with that fallout. And of course, as you know, Senator Leahy also sort of felt a little on the spur of the moment, brought out a proposal also for a commission that really sort of foundered, and I think there was a lot of interesting conversation in a hearing that he held, and it's interesting to note how the opposition members on the panel said, well, why do we need a commission? We have good the criminal process, but yet on the criminal process there's an equal effort to stop and to say this is sort of a witch hunt, that kind of thing. I think one of the sort of red herrings that's put out there always around this question of accountability through an inquiry is this issue of, you don't need to look back. We need to be thinking ahead. We need to be, dealing with all these problems in the current time. But I think the lesson that we learned from so many places around the world that have had also the need for this kind of inquiry is that it doesn't go away. And I think, the European case is a good example. It's right there. All of the work that's being done on documentation, it's right there. That's not going to go away. And I think part of our effort is to make sure it doesn't go away, but that over time this is something that will have to be addressed. I think probably one of the key components of this information coming out is that it needs to be heard, it needs to be acknowledged, and then it has to have consequences. So it's not just a wealth of information that needs to come out, but actually then what do we do with it? So that's one key element to accountability, and in some ways the root of all other accountability. So we build on what we have while we try to obtain more. And I think Chile is a good lesson on this particular example. Originally when the Pinochet regime fell, there was an inquiry into deaths and disappearances only, not torture, not survivors of torture. It was a decade later that there was an inquiry that documented 28,000 victims of torture. And this is a much higher number than the people who were identified as victims in the earlier work. And now, in present day Chile, there is an ongoing effort to try to also document people who've never been registered in this sort of registry of victims. So it is a continuing effort, and one that over time takes mistakes and needs to be continually addressed. On prosecutions, I'll just say a couple of things. I think that there are big questions about responsibility of who is responsible, and who holds them responsible. And I think these are questions that we are dealing with, and that we need to look beyond only the investigation that's ongoing. A preliminary inquiry for the possibility of an investigation is a fairly limited opportunity, and one of the challenges is that as soon as it goes into that investigation mode, we lose sight of it. So it becomes really an under the surface issue that we want to keep raising, but of course there is an independent justice system, and unlike, I guess, the North Carolina officials that were referred to this morning, I have less confidence that that's all being taken care of, it, so it's something that we need to keep raising. And I think the role of documentation, again, and that kind of information that you're putting out is going to feed into the need for prosecution and an impulse that we have to do something about this. Of course, that let's not look back, let's look forward is also used very commonly here. I think Scott Horton said it very well last night, that crimes always occur in the past, so this is a pretty easy red herring to dismiss. But I think the other one is that we've heard so much is that this isn't about crimes, this is about criminalization of policy differences. This is all about policy differences. So I thought it would be interesting to think about the Japanese internment as sort of a comparative example of where, it took a long time for the United States to recognize that this policy of interning people of Japanese descent and Japanese origin during World War II was not just a policy difference, but actually wrong. I think, it was very late in coming, the apology and the reparations and the kinds of measures to redress that. But it's something that we should think about, and how we push for this recognition now that prosecution is one way to really make that statement that this is wrong. And that's how societies define right and wrong, is through this criminal process. We have to make that work. One thing I'll add about the Japanese internment case that I think is very interesting and a lot of us don't know that much about is that out of this national security threat of Japanese people everywhere, Latin Americans who were of Japanese descent were also rounded up by the U.S. administration, put in camps in Panama and Peru, and then eventually transferred to the United States. There was eventually redress in those cases, and I think it's an instance that we need to look at and learn from. On redress, I think that this is something that Julia covered well, and I won't go into it. I do think it's really important that this range of what redress means has to somehow take some root. But I think here the red herring that we run into is, wait a minute, these are bad people. Why are we even talking about redress? We can't talk about, what, we're going to compensate our enemies and, So one answer to that is, well, these are not all bad people. These are innocent people who've been caught up in this web that we've seen of rendition and of detentions that Scott Gordon also spoke about. But there is also a principled answer to that redress is for torture, and if there are crimes committed, that there's a criminal process for that. And so we need to keep that very separate, and we need to be able to respond to this question. I think on this point, Peru is an interesting example, because in Peru there was a significant, during the internal conflict, the use of sort of a similar national security threat of terror, and there was a very real threat of terror in Peru operating through the Shining Path. And there was a Truth Commission there that looked at these questions, and eventually a Truth Commission report that found that there were significant violations committed by the Shining Path, also by government in response, and that they had to think about, well, what does it mean, the fact that some of these people who were victims of torture and of other horrible crimes by the state terrorism that responded, what do we do about that? How do we understand it? And I think it's a struggle today in Peru. I think there is still that division in the social discourse and in the mind of many Peruvians that didn't still really get to that level of humanity. So that it is still, but they're terrorists. So how do we, grapple with that? I think that shows us the depth to which these sort of beliefs and how deep that fear drives both bias and prejudice and racism, as well as the kind of legitimate fear that may have a certain core there. So these are cases that I think should inform some of our thinking. I think on institutional reform, one thing that's important to think about is that we need to not only stop abuses and ensure that there are the mechanisms in place and that they're well informed by the past so that we fully address what happened, but we also need to be sure that accountability is part of that package, so that in the future going forward, were questions to arise about treatment of detainees, or are there flights taking place, that when one calls in Ireland, if you're calling for an investigation to search that plane, that actually there is a response, there is a concern, and something happens. So these consequences from information. I don't know how I'm doing on time, so I have a couple more points I can make, but maybe 5 minutes. All right. I know that one of the questions that you want to tackle here is the notion of a truth process for North Carolina regarding this issue. And I struggle with it in terms of how to think about it, and just wanted to lay out some things that I think truth commissions can do quite well, and then challenge us to think about what of these things may be appropriate and how it might be tailored to fit the North Carolina context. I think truth commissions capture very well the testimonies of people who are not usually heard. And this I think you'll hear about in the Greensboro case, how history is told, what is the story that's told, and what is the recent past. Whose voice are we hearing? Whose voice is missing here? How does North Carolina bring that voice? And it may not just be people like Fisher, it may be people in North Carolina who are feeling these effects in different ways. Refugee communities, the Muslim community, military families, the medical profession. I don't know. I think that's for you to sift through and think about, but this is a question. Commissions are good at showing patterns of abuse, and I think we saw from Gavin's presentation this web of, how this is not just one isolated event, but this is actually a systematic set of violations. How does North Carolina fit into that? You want to show some sort of local or regional pattern that fits into a larger pattern. What do you need to know? What do you need to look at? And how does that then fit with other abuses and violations and actors that may be located in North Carolina or related to North Carolina? So that may draw in things like Blackwater and now XE. That's, I understand, based here as well. So, how do you start to draw those patterns as well? Or is it just too much to try to take on? I think in that sense, too, that truth commissions are good at raising not only the legal challenges of what has happened, but also the ethical, moral questions. And so we need to think about how do you frame that in a way that engages the population of a place like North Carolina. Truth commissions can crack open denial and combat sort of what I would call willing ignorance, the refusal sort of to bother about it. But how do you engage people? I think in a lot of countries, Latin America's been referenced, but other countries as well, that have undergone truth commissions, this is about sort of healing the nation. There has been, victims of one part of the society from the other part, and it's a much more sort of close at home kind of situation. How do you raise this issue on a global scale? And I think it is sort of making the global local and thinking about that this is, a community in a global setting, that the United States has a different role in the world, but also how to make the local felt. And I think that's something we need to really challenge ourselves to think about. Truth commissions through public hearings and other forms of engagement with the public can really bring to life information, can relate this negative history to issues in North Carolina today. What would you be, thinking about doing if you did something like that, and how would it engage a broader community than those who are already committed to an understanding of what this has meant? Just two last points. I think that truth commissions provide a base from which to think about how to move forward, and to move forward in a way that's corrective, that looks to justice, more truth, reparations, and reform, and builds a base for thinking about concretely what should those look like. And I think that particularly in a regional context, that can be a very, very rich input into a national conversation as well. If you can get a local action on it, that's fantastic. And if that then feeds into a discussion of these issues on a national level, which we do hope still will happen in some form, whether it's an official inquiry sometime well into the future, or whether private citizens are taking this on themselves, at a high level or on a popular level like here in North Carolina, that we will have something to grapple with there. I think I will leave you with those thoughts, and certainly hope that we'll have an opportunity, if not in questions and answers as we've run over time, to today that some of you will be gathered tomorrow and will have a chance to think a little bit about the meat of these questions and how we might give them some shape to actually put accountability, take it out of that realm of just a concept and one of our dreams, and to think about, well, what does it look like on the ground? How do we make that happen? So I thank you for that.
I wonder if either Lisa or Cynthia will tell the success story about the Klansmen.
I'll jump at the one that
They came back and talked about and asked for forgiveness.
There was the gentleman, if you ever see the video, he has a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He was one of the people who was shooting. And actually, you know, it's interesting that you raised that question, because I want to say that it was very important that he came. He actually, I think, is one of the people who actually had a gun and people saw him shooting. And so he asked Sidney Waller and her son and Nelson met with him, and he asked for forgiveness. They prayed together, and he really, you know, apologized, you know, for his role in the process, and actually met with the commission, so we had an opportunity to interview him. But I also want to say one of the things that raises for me is this way that people talk about reconciliation in different ways. And so, you know, for me, it is difficult to think about reconciliation without reparation, and yet you want to at least affirm and acknowledge that when space is created for people to go back and visit these things, that you can have apology as a part of what people need, and creating a space where people who have been harmed have an opportunity to tell their story from whichever perspective they participated in that process. So thank you.
I'd like to ask a question as well.
Yeah.
You could talk about my area.
You know, we trying to get one person to ask a question. We're not just
but I
doing.
believe you passed over me several times.
Well, you've already asked a question.
No, I haven't.
Mine's just really quick, I think. For Julia, I'd be curious to know who paid those reparations, where'd the money come from? And for Lisa and Cynthia, obviously, Cynthia mentioned the diversity of perspectives on the commission gave the commission credibility and was really key to the success of the commission. How are the commissioners chosen, and what would you recommend in terms of keys to establishing credibility for this commission?
Well, in my attempt to be brief, I forgot to mention that the actual outcome of the Maher-Arar inquiry found that it was Canadian, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and their intelligence service had actually given the U.S. government information that led, at least in part, to Maher's transfer. So the idea was, what was the Canadian nexus? And so the compensation payment that was paid by the Canadian government for the actions of its own actors. In Sweden, the compensation likewise was paid by the government because there were these findings at the UN level that Sweden had violated its international obligations under the Convention Against Torture and under the ICCPR, which you heard about earlier. Therefore, it was incumbent upon them, given this jurisprudence from UN treaty bodies, to make some sort of affirmative step toward redress. And the compensation by the Swedish government for Ahmed Giza and Mohammed Al-Zari was just one piece of that.
I was going to respond to the second question. There was a second part to that question, so I just wanted to quickly refer to the selection process and how that aided credibility. I think in Greensboro it was really interesting. The people who put together the process said they wanted to, in a way, model the democracy they wished they had, that would have avoided this kind of incident. They reached out to a lot of different constituent groups of the community, I think 16 or 17. Not everybody participated, but it was a wide range of how community was organized, and so they had these representatives come together, and out of nominations that were submitted by anyone from Greensboro, they then selected these poor unsuspecting commissioners to take on this enormous task. That's not always the way it happens. The people who came together, community representatives, selected out of I think 70 nominees. 70.
Can you give some examples of the organizations that run this?
Yeah, I mean, it included like the political parties, it included neighborhood organizations, included different religious groups, included labor. So there was a wide variety of groups. And university presidents, also student bodies. There's a lot of universities and colleges in Greensboro. So they were the ones who actually selected the commissioners. And I think the fact that the mayor, even though the city was opposed to the commission, the mayor did put someone on that selection panel, and I think that was sort of the first step of credibility for some people. And for others, it was this broad range that felt like a democratic process that allowed these commissioners to be named. What I was going to say is that that's not always the case of how selection occurs. It a little bit mirrors the South African example, but in other cases, people are just appointed and I think have to build credibility. And even in the Greensboro case, that credibility was incremental, as first some credibility through how they're named, some for who they are, and the diversity of that panel. But then as they started to work and relate to the community, it built more credibility. Hearings where a wide array of people came and testified, another point of credibility, and then of course their report, et cetera. So that's the way commissions also, over time, gain and earn that trust of others who may doubt in the beginning.
Heart. I was wondering if y'all could, one or two of you could address dealing with the military communities on this issue.
Do you want to compare that a little? Well, I mean, to some extent, maybe it's thinking a little bit like sort of what are the other voices? What's the other perspectives that you're going to maybe run into? And how do you be open to those perspectives? How do you include that voice? But how do you frame it so that you can have that credibility and that they feel also welcome to participate and engage? What are the questions that you're trying to answer? How are they related to those questions and answers, and how are you going to discuss the process of creating this? Is it something you spring on them fully formed? Is it something you have discussions as you're starting to give shape to the idea of truth-seeking? What are the issues that they think would be important in addressing? And I think, a little bit about the lawyers and judges and prosecutors who participated in the Greensboro hearings, really came out and told their side of how it worked, and people drew their own conclusions, and the commission reviewed that evidence. But I think having that perspective was very valuable. But I think it's really about what are the questions you're trying to frame? What is the issue here? And thinking about, in North Carolina, with an important military presence here, how does this relate to that? And how are you going to raise the issue of accountability in the state of North Carolina in a way that's going to recognize that this is there and has both an interest and maybe a role to play? So I think that those are sort of a general answer, but I think things you'll have to grapple with.
I think in this instance you have something really legitimate to share with military communities, and that is the words of the military and of former intelligence agents and FBI about these practices themselves. You can turn those words back on to our military counterparts, our military families. Many generals, former generals, other military folks have come out against these practices. Former intelligence agents have come out against these practices. In some instances, you have to be careful because sometimes it's a very instrumental argument. And of course, we want a moral and ethical and legal argument, but nonetheless, use every tool in the toolbox. If you have a general or a former intelligence agent who says, I was deeply involved in intelligence gathering in X situation, and I know that torture doesn't work. Well, that doesn't ring in our ears. It's the exact thing we want to say, but I think if you pair that with the more ethical and moral arguments that some former generals have made in terms of American military authority, moral authority, and with the words of FBI agents, current and former, who come out against these practices. In other words, take the very community that we often find ourselves pitted against who have come over to the side of being against rendition and secret detention for whatever reason, piece that together into a nice constellation in terms of argumentation, and share that with families in those environments. I think that's a really useful tool that is not used often enough. And in this regard, I would point you to Human Rights First, the former Lawyers Committee that has worked actively with military, former military, and the intelligence and FBI community on this. And look at their website for sources to help articulate what would be meaningful in those communities.
What was the last group you made?
Human Rights First.
Did you want to speak on that topic? Okay, well, we have, I think, a lot of need and desire to interact with each other and speak as a group together, and that's exactly what we're going to do next with the roundtable. So what I'd like to do is ask us to take a 10-minute break and then come back, and we'll have the roundtable, which will involve short presentations from a set of discussants on the topic of an accountability process here in North Carolina, and then it'll involve you speaking and interacting with those discussants. So first, let's give a big hand to the panel who just spoke very interestingly to us. Thank you very much.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.